The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's ICU hummed their mechanical prayer at 5:06 a.m., a sound so constant that most people stopped hearing it within a week. Hannah Clarke never stopped hearing it. After 18 years of quiet work, first in operating theaters where silence meant focus, then in hallways where silence meant respect, she'd learned that sounds carried information. The ventilator in room 306 wheezed its rhythm. The cardiac monitor in 312 beeped its steady reassurance. The 4-pump in 309 clicked its measured drip. She moved through these sounds like a conductor reading an orchestra, her sneakers silent on the cold linoleum, adjusting monitors with fingers that never fumbled, never hesitated, never required a second glance at the equipment. Her name tag read Clarke, RN, nothing more, nothing less. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining stayed hidden, tucked beneath layers of starched cotton and careful anonymity, the way she'd been trained to keep all her edges sharp and all her edges invisible. The ICU at Sacred Heart stretched across the East Wing, the wing that bore Dr. Nathan Sterling's family name in bronze lettering near the main entrance. The hospital administration had commissioned that plaque 7 years ago when Sterling's father endowed a cardiac suite. Now Sterling himself walked these corridors as the unit's director, a man whose competence was never in question but whose approach to leadership operated on a principle that Hannah recognized from her military years: control through hierarchy, dominance through deference. He moved through the unit now, at 5:52 a.m., his white coat pressed to perfection, his stethoscope draped like a badge of authority. He was 38, fit in the way that came from a membership at a private gym, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, his presence the kind that made residents straighten and nurses find sudden tasks elsewhere. Hannah was checking the medication cabinet when Sterling entered, verifying the count against the logbook with the methodical precision that had kept her hand steady through worse than pharmacy audits. She didn't look up immediately. She never did. The moment of pause before eye contact was a deliberate choice, not submission exactly, but strategic restraint. When she did glance toward him, her eyes moved back to the task within a second, her voice emerging barely above a whisper, "Good morning, Dr. Sterling." It was the tone of someone who knew her place and had made peace with it, the careful architecture of a person who'd learned that invisibility was safer than recognition. Sterling watched her work. He always did during the morning shift, a quality control check that he framed as leadership but that Hannah recognized as something closer to surveillance. She could feel his eyes tracking the smooth movement of her hands as she closed the cabinet and locked it, the way she pivoted to move toward the patient rooms without wasted motion, the slight limp that appeared when she'd been standing too long, the legacy of a shrapnel wound from Tikrit that she'd never reported, never mentioned, never acknowledged in any official capacity. What Sterling saw was what everyone saw: a capable nurse, efficient, quiet, competent. What he didn't see, what no one saw, was that her movements carried the muscle memory of combat triage, the kind of speed and precision that came from sorting the salvageable from the lost under fire, with 3 minutes between life and death and a choice that would haunt her either way. She'd been at Sacred Heart for 3 years now, long enough to establish a reputation for dependability but not long enough to become memorable. Long enough to know every patient's history and medication schedule but not long enough to cross the invisible boundary that separated competent staff from threatening presence. The other nurses had stopped trying to include her in break-room conversations by the second month. They weren't cruel about it, just a natural sorting, the way water finds its own level. Hannah ate her lunch alone at the desk, reading medical journals on her phone, existing in the space between professional and invisible. It was, she decided, the optimal configuration for someone whose existence in any public capacity was supposed to be temporary. Room 312 needed new drain pads, and Hannah gathered them with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through the steps without conscious direction, saline wipe, pressure applied for exactly 12 seconds, fresh pads secured with a kind of tape job that would hold for a full shift without causing skin breakdown. The patient, Mrs. Reeves, a 73-year-old post-op cardiac bypass, watched Hannah work with the particular gratitude of someone who could tell the difference between competence and care. "You're very gentle," Mrs. Reeves said, her voice still hoarse from the breathing tube. Hannah made brief eye contact, the corners of her mouth lifting in something that might have been a smile. "Just practice," she said. 5 words. Always 5 words or fewer in patient interactions, enough to be human, not enough to be memorable. Sterling was speaking with Dr. Marcus Halloway, the morning shift resident, near the nurse's station when Hannah returned the supply cart to its place. She could hear their conversation without appearing to listen, a skill she'd honed to something like an art form. "Clarke is solid," Sterling was saying, his voice carrying the undertone of someone appraising machinery. "Knows the protocols, doesn't ask questions, doesn't need much supervision. Keeps to herself. The patients like her, which is fine, keeps them calm, but she doesn't overstep. That's what matters." He paused, and Hannah felt the weight of his attention shift toward her for just a moment. She understands the hierarchy. Halloway, a resident 3 months into his rotation, nodded without the kind of critical assessment that might have suggested deeper observation. "She seems really good with the equipment." "She's a technician," Sterling said, and something in his tone suggested he meant it as a compliment wrapped around a boundary. "Not a clinician. There's a difference." Hannah finished organizing the cart with the same deliberate precision she'd applied to everything else, her movements neither rushed nor slow, perfectly calibrated to the rhythm of the unit. She'd learned a long time ago that reactions, visible ones, emotional ones, were the fastest way to become a problem. In Tikrit, she'd watched officers read people the way other men read newspapers, watching for the micro-expressions that revealed what someone was actually thinking rather than what they were saying. Sterling wasn't that sophisticated, but he was observant in his way. Better to be a cipher than a complication. The admission alert came through at 6:14 a.m., incoming patient to room 314, primary complaint chest pain, presenting vitals elevated. Hannah pulled the file while Sterling was still reviewing morning labs with the residents. She scanned the name first, if Marcus Webb, age 47, then the vitals, the history, the clinical notes from the ER. The data arranged itself in her mind with the speed of long practice: 3 days of progressive chest discomfort, shortness of breath on exertion, history of hypertension not well controlled, blood pressure currently 168/104. The intake note mentioned Army Ranger, retired, current construction work. The ER had run an EKG, normal sinus rhythm, no acute changes noted, and written recommend cardiology consultation pending bed availability. Hannah's hand froze on the keyboard for exactly half a second. Just half a second. A pause so brief that anyone watching would have assumed it was nothing more than the natural hesitation of reading. But in that half second, something in her chest had tightened, the way it tightened sometimes when she heard a helicopter overhead, when she smelled diesel exhaust near the loading dock, when she saw a man with the particular bearing that came from carrying a rifle for 20 years. The Ranger. There was always the possibility. Not likely, statistically speaking, the Rangers were dispersed across the country, across the world, but possible. She'd learned long ago not to count on statistical improbability when it came to the past catching up to you. She pulled the full file, reading with the careful attention of someone who'd been trained to extract information from incomplete data. Marcus Webb, discharged 2007 from Joint Base Ballard after medical evacuation. Construction foreman, no significant medical history prior to service. Divorced, one daughter listed as emergency contact. The clinical picture was straightforward: a man in his late 40s with risk factors and a presentation that warranted cardiac workup. Straightforward and potentially urgent. The EKG was reassuring but not conclusive. Troponin levels pending. A stress test would be the reasonable next step, maybe an echocardiogram to rule out pericarditis or other structural abnormalities. Sterling appeared at the desk before she'd finished reviewing the notes. He scanned the monitor, his eyes moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested more habit than genuine engagement. 314's the Ranger, he said, not a question. Marcus Webb. Army, retired. 3 days of chest pain, worse with exertion. Hannah kept her voice neutral, informative, the tone of someone providing data rather than opinion. Sterling nodded, already dismissing the file from his attention. Likely musculoskeletal. Gets worse with exertion, that's what it usually is, muscle strain from physical work. Keep him on monitor protocol, get baseline labs, but there's no rush on the cardiology consult. We can refer out if the troponin comes back elevated, but I'd bet money it doesn't. He said this with the absolute certainty of a man who'd been right enough times to stop questioning his instincts. "Let me know if anything changes, but I'm not expecting anything." Hannah nodded, filing the instruction without comment. She'd learned that questions triggered defensiveness, and defensiveness triggered decisions made for the wrong reasons. Sterling needed to feel authoritative more than he needed to be right. That was useful information, the kind that kept interaction smooth and didn't require anyone to be concerned with her opinion on the matter. She'd see Marcus Webb in a few minutes when he arrived at the unit. She'd monitor his vitals, run his labs, keep him comfortable. If something changed, if the clinical picture shifted, she'd escalate through proper channels, which meant speaking to Sterling again, which meant another potential conversation about hierarchy and lanes and knowing one's place. Room 314 was being prepped by one of the housekeeping staff, a woman named Diego who worked with the same quiet competence that Hannah recognized in herself. They'd nodded at each other several times but never spoken beyond professional courtesy. Hannah helped strip the previous patient's bedding, her movements efficient and practiced, her hands moving through the familiar geometry of hospital corners and fresh blankets, antiseptic spray misting the air with its sharp chemical bite. The smell of it, harsh and sterile, had long since stopped bothering her. It was the smell of order imposed on chaos, of procedures and protocol and the careful management of human fragility. She'd smelled worse in Tikrit. She'd smelled blood and burning and something like despair in forms that antiseptic couldn't touch. The bed was ready by 6:31 a.m., everything arranged for the arrival of a man whose name had triggered exactly half a second of hesitation, whose file suggested nothing remarkable, whose presence in room 314 might mean nothing at all. Hannah moved on to check the other rooms, reviewing morning lab results with a concentration that was both genuine and strategic. Focus on the present task. Keep the edges invisible. Don't let the past become present. Don't let questions become complications. It was a formula that had worked for 3 years, that had kept her safe in the particular way that safety mattered when your actual identity was supposed to be erased, when your existence in any public capacity was theoretical, when surfacing would endanger 12 men whose names she couldn't speak and whose lives depended on her staying disappeared. The morning shift continued its rhythm. Monitor beeps in patterns that meant nothing, in patterns that meant everything. The 4-pump clicked its measured drip. Dr. Sterling moved through the unit with the assured bearing of a man who'd never questioned his right to be wherever he was. And Hannah Clarke moved through the same spaces, through the same unit, through the same morning that might change nothing at all or might change everything, and she did it with the particular calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The hallway outside room 314 was empty except for Hannah and the sound of Sterling's voice still echoing in her ears. She stood motionless for 3 full seconds, that single tear tracking down her cheek like a river carving through stone, her hand still raised where she'd wiped it. Her jaw was clenched so tight she could feel the muscles bunching at her temples. One measured breath. Then another. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you could do and choosing not to do it. Inside room 314, Marcus Webb lay in the hospital bed with his daughter Sarah perched on the visitor's chair, her face still flushed from Sterling's public humiliation of the quiet nurse. Webb himself was drowsy, his breathing shallow, his chest rising and falling in the irregular rhythm that Hannah had documented 3 times already. She'd seen that pattern in a field hospital outside Tikrit 12 years ago. She knew what it meant. But Sterling had written the order for antacids and observation. Antacids. As if a man's heart filling with fluid could be treated with calcium carbonate and reassurance. Hannah pushed open the door to room 314 with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. Sarah looked up, her expression shifting from anger to something like concern when she saw the nurse's face. Hannah didn't acknowledge it. She moved to the monitor, checked Webb's vitals with mechanical precision, the blood pressure cuff hissing as it inflated, the numbers appearing on the screen like a verdict, 148/92, climbing. She made a note in the chart, her handwriting steady as surgical steel despite the controlled fury moving through her like current through copper wire. "How are you feeling, Mr. Webb?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, the same voice Sterling had just dismissed as inadequate for anything beyond bedpans. Webb's eyes opened partway, unfocused. He was medicated, comfortable, sedated, which meant he wouldn't notice the small burn of anger in Hannah's throat or the way her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd performed medical interventions in far worse circumstances than a climate-controlled hospital room. She lingered for another moment, checking the fall line, confirming the monitor leads were secure. Webb's left forearm lay exposed above the blanket, and there it was, the tattoo that made her heart skip for just half a second before she controlled it. Clarke, in military stencil font. From a sandstorm and a firefight and a wall she'd pushed him behind while rounds snapped overhead like angry hornets. She'd pulled him out of a collapsed building in the Jolan district while his leg bled and his squad returned fire. She'd sat with him in a medevac helicopter as his blood pressure dropped and his eyes rolled back. She'd written his name on a casualty list that never made the news. And now his eyes, unfocused and medicated, passed over her name tag without the faintest flicker of recognition. The break room was the color of old tile and resignation. Hannah sat alone at the plastic table, her lunch container open in front of her, and watched three nurses who'd been mid-conversation suddenly remember things they needed to do elsewhere. Chairs scraped. Excuses were murmured. One of them, a woman named Chen who'd nodded at Hannah for 3 years without ever speaking to her, caught her eye near the sink. "Don't get involved with this," Chen whispered, her voice the consistency of spoiled milk. "Sterling's gunning for you. He has allies on the board. People don't mess with him and come out okay." Then Chen was gone, and Hannah was alone with a salad she no longer wanted to eat. She ate anyway, methodical and slow. Hospital food. Plastic fork. Water from a plastic cup. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head with the persistent drone of a machine that never stops, never questions, never rests. Hannah had sat in worse places eating worse food, and she'd eaten it while people screamed outside the tent and medics shouted coordinates into radios. This was manageable. This was nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. Friday afternoon, the unit board near the nurses' station had been updated. Hannah saw it when she came in for the evening shift, a white sheet of paper pinned below the schedule, her name highlighted in yellow marker like a target painted on her back. Clarke, H. Written warning for questioning physician judgment and exceeding scope of practice. 6 staff members pretended not to notice as she read it, their eyes carefully averted, their conversation suddenly very focused on their phones or their paperwork or anything that wasn't Hannah Clarke standing in front of proof that she'd been officially deemed inadequate. Sterling walked past her in the hallway, his white coat crackling like paper wings. He stopped just close enough for her to smell his cologne, something expensive that probably cost more than Hannah's weekly groceries, and smiled at her with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd successfully marginalized someone he deemed beneath his notice. "Maybe you'll learn some humility, sweetie." His voice was warm, almost kind, which made it worse. He wasn't angry. He was satisfied. He was sure. Hannah didn't respond. She didn't need to. The yellow highlighted sheet said everything Sterling needed her to say. She was a nurse who'd overstepped. She was a nurse who questioned physicians. She was a nurse who didn't understand her place in the hierarchy, and now the hierarchy had corrected her. Sterling walked away confident in his victory, secure in the knowledge that Hannah Clarke would think twice before questioning his medical judgment again. He had no idea he was standing 3 feet away from someone who'd coordinated a tactical withdrawal of 14 personnel under sustained fire. He had no idea that the quiet woman with the invisible forearm had performed emergency field surgery in conditions that would have made a trauma surgeon weep. He had no idea that her restraint, her refusal to respond, her acceptance of his condescension, was the only thing keeping her fist from connecting with his jaw hard enough to rearrange his face. But Hannah did know. She knew exactly what she was capable of. And she knew exactly why she couldn't do it. That evening, during the night shift briefing, Hannah reviewed the charts in the medication room, that small, locked space where the narcotics lived and where nurses went when they needed 3 minutes away from the floor. The door was solid, the walls were thick, and no one asked questions about why someone might need to sit in the dark for a moment. She pulled up Marcus Webb's file on the computer. 3 documented concerns from nursing staff about cardiac symptoms. 3 times she'd requested a workup. 3 times Sterling had overruled her. The chart notation was there, professional and dry, 1,600 hours, RN Clarke requesting EKG and echocardiogram for assessment of possible pericardial effusion. Attending physician deferred, ordered observation and antacid trial. 1,800 hours, RN Clarke noting elevated JVD and muffled heart sounds. Attending physician directed continued conservative management. 2,100 hours, RN Clarke documenting patient restlessness and complaint of dyspnea. Monitor shows sinus tachycardia. Attending physician declining further intervention. The documentation was perfect. It was also useless. Sterling's name was on that chart, and Sterling's name meant something at Sacred Heart Hospital. His family name was on the East Wing. His connections ran through the board like electrical current. He was untouchable. Hannah closed the file and sat in the darkness of the medication room for exactly 2 minutes, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply existed in that small space and let herself feel the particular anger that comes from knowing exactly what needs to happen and being powerless to make it happen through normal channels. When she came out, her uniform was crisp, her badge was clipped to her pocket, and her face was composed into the expression of a competent nurse going about her duties. No one looking at her would have seen anything unusual. No one would have noticed the way her eyes had gone flat and clear as a soldier's eyes before a mission. It was 11:13 p.m. when the monitor alarm in room 314 began to sound, not the routine rhythm that precedes a scheduled alert, but the sharp, demanding beep of something wrong. Hannah's feet were already moving before her brain had finished registering the sound, her body responding to something beyond conscious thought. She was in the room before the alarm had finished its first sequence, and what she saw made every training instinct inside her activate with the precision of a weapon being drawn. Marcus Webb was awake now, clutching his chest, his skin the color of wet newspaper, his jugular veins distending like ropes beneath his skin. The blood pressure monitor was screaming numbers that belonged to a dying man, 78/52 and dropping. His breathing was shallow, rapid, desperate, the breathing of someone whose lungs were being compressed by something that shouldn't be compressing them. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid around his heart was filling faster than his heart could beat, squeezing the life out of him with the slow, patient pressure of a fist closing around his throat. Hannah hit the code button. Her voice changed, dropped an octave, became command loud without being loud, became the voice of someone who'd made decisions that kept people alive in conditions that shouldn't have allowed survival. Code blue, room 314. I need a resident and I need a pericardiocentesis kit. Now. Not a request. Not a question. An order delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly what needed to happen and wasn't asking permission to make it happen. A resident appeared in the doorway, wide-eyed and uncertain. We should wait for Dr. Sterling. Nurses can't. Hannah was already moving. Her hands opened the pericardiocentesis kit with the fluid precision of muscle memory, her fingers finding the 18-gauge needle, the syringe, the extension tubing. She'd done this in a sandstorm with a flashlight and a prayer and 3 soldiers screaming that they were out of time. She'd done this in a field hospital where the walls were canvas and the floor was sand and the only light came from a handheld lamp being held by someone whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. She didn't wait for Sterling. Waiting meant watching Marcus Webb's blood pressure drop another 5 points. Waiting meant his heart stopping while a cardiologist drove through the dark Savannah streets convinced that an obese patient's chest pain was anxiety. Waiting meant that the tattoo on Webb's left forearm, the one with her name written in military stencil, would mean nothing at all because the man wearing it would be dead. She positioned the needle beneath the xiphoid process at exactly 45 degrees, the angle that her body remembered even if her conscious mind was trained to believe she'd never learned it at all. The resident was saying something, protesting, but his voice was white noise. Hannah advanced the needle slowly, carefully, with the precision of someone operating on absolute certainty rather than hope. The hiss of air escaping. The sudden give as the needle breached the pericardial sac. The dark blood flowing into the syringe, 50 milliliters, 100, 150, the weight of gravity and pressure and seconds that were ticking down like a countdown to something final. Webb's blood pressure began to climb. 82/58. 88/62. His breathing eased. His eyes flickered open, confused and alive. Sarah burst through the door, her face white, her mouth open to scream or cry or both. She saw the needle in Hannah's hand and stopped moving. She saw her father's vital signs climbing on the monitor. She saw something in the quiet nurse's expression that made her understand, without being told, that this woman had just saved her father's life in a way that wasn't supposed to be possible. 200 milliliters of blood. That was all that stood between Marcus Webb and death. That was the margin. That was the distance between Sterling's condescension and the reality of what a nurse who'd been trained by the Navy's best field surgeons could accomplish with a steady hand and the willingness to break a rule when breaking that rule meant breathing instead of suffocation. Hannah withdrew the needle. She disposed of it in the sharps container with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. She checked Webb's monitor. She confirmed his vitals. She documented what she'd done in the chart with medical terminology that was accurate and complete and would absolutely guarantee that Sterling found out what the quiet nurse had accomplished in the 30 seconds before he arrived. The doors to the ICU exploded open at 1:52 a.m., and Dr. Sterling stopped dead in the center of the unit, his face transforming from sleep-rumpled confusion to purple-faced rage as he registered what he was seeing: a nurse holding a pericardiocentesis needle, his patient alive and stable, and every resident and attending standing motionless around the bed like observers at an execution. The needle went in. Smooth. Precise. The angle exactly 17 degrees, muscle memory taking over before conscious thought could interfere. Hannah's hands moved the way they had moved in a sandstorm outside Tikrit with nothing but a flashlight and a prayer, the way they had moved when 3 men lay bleeding in a compound and the evac bird was still 20 minutes out. Beneath the xiphoid process. The landmark where ribs met sternum, the gateway to the pericardial sac where Webb's heart was drowning in its own fluid. 2:04 a.m. Webb's oxygen saturation had dropped like a stone at 1:58, 88%, then 84, then 79. His blood pressure collapsing. The ventilator hissing its mechanical rhythm, but the numbers on the monitor told the true story: muffled heart sounds, distended jugular veins, the classic triad of cardiac tamponade. Death arriving on a ticking clock. Hannah had not waited. She did not wait for Sterling's arrival. She had moved to the crash cart, her fingers finding the pericardiocentesis kit without looking, the way a pilot's hands find the ejection handle in darkness. 18-gauge needle. Sterile field prepped in 12 seconds. The antiseptic smell of chlorhexidine sharp against her skin as she swabbed the chest wall, her movements economical, deliberate, the movements of someone who had done this before under circumstances that would have paralyzed most people into hesitation. The needle advanced. She felt the resistance of skin, then muscle, then the subtle give of the pericardial membrane parting. The syringe drew back. The plunger moved. And then the blood came, dark, thick, collecting in the syringe like a confession. 100 cc. 150. 200. Webb's oxygen saturation climbed. 82, 86. 91. The heart monitor's rhythm shifted from the muffled, distant sound it had carried all night to something stronger, more insistent, the echo of a heart that suddenly had room to beat again. His blood pressure responded. 68/42 becoming 78/50. Becoming 89/58. The numbers climbing back toward the margin between life and death, crossing the threshold, moving into the territory of survival. Hannah set down the syringe. Checked the EKG. Sinus rhythm. Stable. The kind of stable that meant Webb would see morning. The kind of stable that meant she had just committed the single most consequential act of professional insubordination possible in American medicine. The doors exploded open at 2:07 a.m. Dr. Sterling stopped dead at the foot of the bed, his face moving through a sequence of expressions like someone cycling through a carousel of emotions he could not control. Confusion first, what was happening, why was a nurse at the bedside with a procedure kit? Then recognition of what he was seeing. Then the purple flush of rage climbing from his neck like a tide. What in God's name? His voice was a thing with teeth. You just performed a physician-only procedure. A Class B felony. That is grounds for termination and immediate license revocation. Hannah did not flinch. Did not blink. She set the kit down on the bedside table with the deliberate precision of someone placing a weapon in neutral territory. When she turned to face him, her eyes were flat, empty of apology or fear. He would have died in 15 minutes. I don't care if. Get out. Out of this unit. Now. You are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation by hospital administration and the Georgia Board of Nursing. Sterling's hands were shaking. His voice had climbed an octave. The rage was not the anger of a man protecting professional standards, it was the fury of a man watching his narrative collapse, watching his control evaporate like blood from a wound. Hannah moved toward the door. She did not argue. Did not defend. Did not explain that she had learned this procedure in a compound where explaining was a luxury you did not have, where lives ended not because you were too bold but because you hesitated. She walked past Sterling with the same quiet composure she had worn through every humiliation of the past 72 hours, the same composure that had driven him to fury because she would not give him the satisfaction of breaking. "You're done," he called after her. "Finished. You understand that? I will destroy your career." She did not turn around. By 6 o'clock that morning, Sterling was in his office making calls, his hand shaking as he dialed, his voice carrying the tremor of a man who could feel the walls closing in but did not yet understand that the walls were of his own construction. The first call went to Charles Whitmore, a board member, a family friend, a man who had attended Sterling's daughter's wedding and would remember that debt when obligations were called in. "Charles, we have a liability issue." Sterling's voice had calibrated itself down to something that approximated reason, though underneath it ran a vein of panic he could not quite suppress. "A nurse on my unit performed a physician-only procedure without authorization. Pericardiocentesis. That's grounds for immediate termination and notification to the state board." The second call went to the Georgia Board of Nursing at 7:15 a.m. when the office opened, Sterling reading from a statement he had drafted with care, each word chosen to maximize damage. "I am filing a formal complaint regarding Hannah Clarke, RN, license number 8 for 7291. She performed a surgical intervention, a pericardiocentesis, without physician supervision or authorization. This represents a violation of nursing scope of practice and poses a direct threat to patient safety." The third call was to an outside HR consultant, a woman named Patricia Mosley who specialized in what she called difficult separations, building termination cases that could withstand legal challenge, documentation so airtight that even the best employment lawyer would advise settlement rather than trial. "I need a termination package," Sterling said. "Professional incompetence. Insubordination. Practicing medicine without a license. I want it ironclad." Then he opened Hannah's personnel file, and his confidence hitched slightly. The employment history began 3 years ago at Sacred Heart. Before that, gaps. Years unaccounted for. Under previous experience, a single line, military healthcare, honorable discharge. No specific dates. No unit designation. No performance reviews. No letters of recommendation. Just that single vague sentence, as if someone had gone through and redacted everything meaningful from her past. He made a note. Underlined it. Something there. Something to probe. Hannah's apartment was small and sparse, the kind of temporary space that someone inhabits without truly living in it. White walls. A bed, made military-tight. A kitchenette with coffee cups but no real food. Books on trauma medicine stacked against one wall. A single framed photograph on the nightstand, a man in marine dress blues, dark-eyed and lean, his smile carrying the weight of someone who knew what he was smiling at might be temporary. Marcus Chen. Killed in action, Kandahar Province, 2019. Her husband. Dead for years, 2 months, and 17 days. The suspension letter arrived at 9:03 a.m. via email. It was formal. Clinical. It said nothing of Sterling's rage, nothing of the actual circumstances. It said only that pending an investigation, Hannah Clarke was placed on immediate paid suspension and was not to enter Sacred Heart Hospital except for human resources meetings. It said the investigation could take weeks. It said nothing about whether she would have a job at the end of it. Hannah opened the locked drawer beside her bed, the only drawer that had a key. Inside, the flag from Marcus's funeral, folded into the precise triangle the military uses when you are taking away someone's entire future and replacing it with cloth. A photo album. And a box. The box she had not opened in 4 years because opening it would make something real that she needed to keep theoretical, abstract, manageable through distance. Her personal phone rang at 9:47 a.m. Unknown number. Ms. Clarke? This is Sarah Webb. Marcus Webb's daughter. I got your number from the hospital directory. The voice was young, trembling with emotion. Hannah recognized instantly. I was at Dad's bedside when it happened. When he crashed. I saw what you did. They're telling me you saved his life. I don't understand why they're suspending you. That's insane. Hannah closed her eyes. Heard the machines. Heard Webb's oxygen saturation climbing. Heard the rotor wash of a Black Hawk that never arrived in Tikrit, the birds always too late, always minutes away when minutes were what you did not have. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, Hannah said, and then she hung up before her voice could betray her further. The cemetery was 3 miles from her apartment, and the rain began before she got there, not the soft rain of afternoon but the hard, accusatory rain that fell like judgment, like the sky itself was disappointed in you. Bonaventure Cemetery, Savannah, the graves arranged under live oaks heavy with Spanish moss, the whole place designed to remind you that everyone ends up in the same quantity of ground, rank and file and service record notwithstanding. She stood at Marcus's grave for 8 minutes. The rain soaked through her jacket. The unit patch inside the lining, the faded 3rd Battalion insignia, the only thing she had saved, felt heavier than it should, as if all those deaths, all those operations, all those moments when she had moved through darkness with a weapon in her hands and murder in her heart were somehow compressed into a piece of fabric the size of her palm. I saved another one, she said to the headstone, her voice barely audible above the rain. But this time I couldn't stay invisible. I'm sorry. I failed us. Thunder rolled across the cemetery like distant artillery. Hannah turned and walked back to her car, and she did not know that every step she took was carrying her toward a reckoning that would arrive before dawn the next morning, a phone call, a name she had not heard in 4 years, a voice that would say a single sentence and change everything. By morning, Sterling had mobilized every connection his family name carried. The phone call started at 6:47 a.m., first to Dr. Patricia Chen, who sat on the hospital board and whose daughter Sterling's firm had once represented in a custody dispute. Then to James Whitmore, the board's treasurer, who owed Sterling a favor from a golf trip to Hilton Head. Then to Margaret Alcott, the board chair whose late husband had been Sterling's roommate at Duke. He didn't ask directly. He never did. He spoke in the language of concerned colleagues, troubling credentials discrepancies, unauthorized procedures, patient safety implications. His voice carried the practiced condescension of a man who had never been told no by an institution. By 7:15 a.m., the HR department had received a formal request for investigation, marked urgent. By 7:43 a.m., an outside consultant, Gerald Hensley, a man whose entire career was built on making problems disappear, had been contacted and was already opening his laptop at a corner table in Sacred Heart's administrative wing. His specialty was termination cases. His track record was flawless. He'd never lost one. The Georgia Board of Nursing received Sterling's letter at 8:20 a.m. It was meticulously written, carefully worded to raise just enough doubt without making direct accusations. Questions regarding the completeness of Ms. Clarke's educational documentation. Concerns about her clinical decision-making authority. Request for expedited credential verification. The letter was copied to 3 board members and the State Attorney General's office. Sterling knew exactly how the machine worked. Feed it doubt, let it churn, and by the time the truth surfaced, the damage would be irreversible. Hannah's suspension notice arrived at 10:14 a.m., printed on hospital letterhead, sealed in a manila envelope. The parking lot was already rain-soaked when she read it in her car. The word swam on the page: immediate suspension pending investigation. Unauthorized performance of invasive medical procedure. Questions regarding qualifications and credentials. The envelope also contained a letter from the Georgia Board of Nursing. They were initiating a preliminary review. It would take weeks. During those weeks, she would not be permitted to work, not permitted to access the hospital, not permitted to see patients. The rain hammered against the windshield like it was trying to break through glass. Hannah sat motionless, the envelope in her lap, and for the first time in 4 years, she felt the old weight settling back onto her shoulders. The weight of secrets. The weight of the mission in Tikrit. The weight of the 12 men whose names she was not permitted to speak, whose lives had depended on her death being official. 62 minutes later, she was standing in front of a grave marker in Bonaventure Cemetery. The rain had not stopped. Corporal James Clarke, USMC, 1985 to 2009, beloved husband. His name carved into granite, his life compressed into a dash. The grass around the headstone was waterlogged, and her uniform, she was still in her scrubs, hadn't even gone home, clung to her skin like a second layer of guilt. Her hand pressed against the cold stone. The rain ran down her face and she didn't wipe it away. When she spoke, her voice came out as something between a whisper and a broken laugh. I saved another one, James. Just like we promised. I kept my hands in the game, kept helping. But this time I couldn't stay invisible. The rain drummed on the cemetery, on the headstones, on her shoulders. Sterling's going to dig. He's already digging. And if he digs deep enough, if my name surfaces in any military database, if someone starts asking questions about Hannah Clarke before 2013, she stopped. Swallowed. The operation stays buried only if I do. That was the deal. That was always the deal. She slid down to sit in the mud beside the grave, her back against the headstone, rain pouring down. The scrub soaked through. Her hands, steady through every crisis, steady through Tikrit and Fallujah and Ramadi, trembled now. After that black operation went sideways and those senators needed deniability, they made Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke disappear. They boxed my medals. Scrubbed my records. Told me if I ever surfaced, if I ever said a word, it would compromise 12 men. 12 brothers. I was supposed to vanish and stay vanished. Her voice cracked. 8 years. I did 8 years in the dark, James. I became a nurse instead of a ghost. I became invisible by choice. But I couldn't let Webb die. I couldn't. And now. She sobbed, the sound swallowed by rain. Her shoulders shook. For the first time since Tikrit, the composure failed completely. 3 miles away, in a conference room on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart, Dr. Sterling sat across from Gerald Hensley and hospital attorney Richard Kaufman. Between them lay a folder marked Clarke, Hannah, personnel file. It was remarkably thin. This doesn't make sense, Hensley said, flipping through pages. No prior employment history before 2013. No education records, no references, no application materials. It's like she materialized from nowhere. Sterling leaned back in his chair, a thin smile on his face. Falsified credentials. Has to be. How else does someone get a nursing license without a documented background? Kaufman nodded slowly. If we can prove she misrepresented her qualifications, the Georgia board will pull her license themselves. We won't have to terminate her, she'll be unemployable. I want her destroyed, Sterling said quietly. His fingers drummed on the mahogany table. She undermined me in front of a patient's family. She performed a procedure she had no authority to perform. And she questioned my medical judgment. The termination letter will be ready Monday, Kaufman said. But if we can get the Board of Nursing to initiate disciplinary proceedings, that becomes her problem to fight, not ours. Thunder rolled across Savannah like a distant concussion. Rain hammered the windows. None of the 3 men in the conference room noticed. For days later, on day 4 of her suspension, Hannah found herself back at Sacred Heart. She wasn't supposed to be there. But Marcus Webb had woken up fully conscious for the first time since the pericardiocentesis, and the hospital had allowed her one supervised visit. Sarah had requested it, and the administrator, not yet knowing that Sterling had begun his campaign to destroy Hannah's career, had approved it. She was walking past the ER on her way to Webb's room when the trauma alert came through. A construction accident. Male, 41, impaled object in the right shoulder. She stood in the hallway as the stretcher rushed past, routine trauma, until the patient's eyes opened and he saw her face through the window of the gurney. The man's body seized. His hands clenched the sides of the stretcher. And then he began screaming in Arabic, raw, primal sounds that made two nurses step back. Al Ma'ay. Al Ma'ay minute Al Majma. Al Mujahida Al Sakina. The woman. The woman from the compound. The silent warrior. Security moved toward him, hands up, trying to calm him. But his eyes stayed fixed on Hannah, who had gone completely still in the hallway. Her face was pale. Her hands, usually so steady, were clenched at her sides. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Sarah Webb appeared at the end of the corridor, and she saw everything, saw the construction worker screaming Hannah's name in Arabic, saw Hannah's face drain of color, saw her back away like she'd been burned. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Her mind was working, fitting pieces together. A woman the insurgent recognized. A woman from a compound. A woman who moved like smoke. 2 hours later, Sarah found Hannah sitting alone in the parking garage next to her car, rain drumming on the asphalt like ammunition. "Wait," Sarah said, walking toward her. "Please." Hannah kept her back turned, her hand on the car door. "That man recognized you," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "From combat." Hannah's shoulders went rigid. When she turned, her composure had returned, the mask was back in place. But her eyes gave her away. "My father woke up this morning," Sarah continued, stepping closer. "Really woke up. Alert, talking, asking questions. He saw your name on the whiteboard above his bed and he said 2 words, Senior Chief." Hannah's jaw tightened. She said nothing. Sarah pulled a folder from her purse, water-damaged, worn at the edges. "This is my dad's medical evacuation report from Tikrit, 2007. Most of it's classified. But he kept his jacket, the one he was wearing when someone dragged him behind a wall and kept him alive under fire for 6 hours until the medevac arrived. There's a unit patch sewn inside the lining." Sarah opened the folder. Inside was a photograph of a faded patch, barely visible against worn fabric. "He framed it in our hallway. I brought the photo." Hannah looked at the photograph. Her hand rose, trembling now, and she pressed her palm against the image. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered. Rain drummed on the concrete ceiling of the parking garage. A car door slammed somewhere in the distance. Hannah's voice, when it came, was steady again, but a different kind of steady. The kind that came from deep water. Someone who made promises she can't break. By 4 p.m., that conversation had grown into something larger. Sarah had brought the original evacuation report. Hannah had opened up, just slightly, just enough to confirm what Sarah had already pieced together. And Sarah, who had her father's instinct for truth, had made one phone call to a man named Commander Thomas Vance, retired Navy SEAL, who had been her father's team lead in Fallujah. The conversation lasted for minutes. Vance had asked 3 questions. Then he'd said, "I'm driving down. Tell her to stay exactly where she is." At 5:47 p.m., Hannah sat alone in the Sacred Heart lobby, the file open on her lap, pages of redacted text that revealed nothing and everything simultaneously. One line visible, personnel extracted by, redacted, Senior Chief Petty Officer, under sustained enemy fire. The lobby doors opened. A barrel-chested man in his 60s walked in wearing a Navy SEAL insignia polo, his presence immediate and absolute, the kind of presence that made air pressure change in a room. He saw Hannah. He walked directly to her. "Hannah Clarke?" he asked. She nodded. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke," he said, voice rising, "United States Navy, formerly of Naval Special Warfare Group." Nurses in the lobby stopped moving. A janitor paused with his mop. The entire weight of the room shifted toward them. "You served with SEAL Team 3, Vance continued, his voice steady and authoritative. "Joint operations in Tikrit, Fallujah, and Ramadi. Operational codename, Nightingale. You saved my son's life in Fallujah. You moved like smoke through that compound." Dr. Sterling stepped into the lobby at that moment, summoned by security. His face shifted from red to gray in the space of a single breath. "2 Navy Crosses," Vance said, and the words landed like declarations. "A Silver Star. 3 Bronze Stars with Valor. 17 personnel extracted under enemy fire." He paused. "You're a hero, Senior Chief. A ghost hero. But a hero." A man in a dark suit appeared at the other entrance, badge visible, FBI, badge marked Agent Mora. When he spoke, his voice was clipped, precise, the voice of someone used to classified clearances. "Senior Chief Clarke's service record," Agent Mora said, "is classified under Title 50, National Security Statute. Following the compromise of Operation Copper June, she was administratively placed on inactive status and ordered to assume a civilian identity. Officially, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke does not exist in any military database." Sterling tried to speak. Nothing came out. Any attempt to investigate, expose, or publicly disclose her previous identity, Agent Mora continued, looking directly at Sterling, constitutes a federal offense. Sarah Webb stepped forward with her phone, the video recording app running. She had been filming since Vance walked through the doors. The 3rd day of her suspension, a combatant from an insurgent cell she dismantled arrived in the ER with a construction accident injury, crushed hand, multiple fractures, heavy bleeding. The paramedics wheeled him past the nurse's station where Hannah was retrieving her personal items from her locker, the official termination paperwork still unsigned in her jacket pocket. His eyes found hers across the corridor. He went rigid. Then he began shouting in Arabic, his voice cracking with recognition, the woman from the compound, the one who moved like smoke. The ER froze. Nurses stopped mid-stride. The paramedic team exchanged confused glances as the patient continued in broken English, pointing at Hannah with his uninjured hand. You pulled us back. You moved through fire like it wasn't there. How are you here? How are you alive?" Hannah's jaw tightened. She did not move. She did not respond. She simply closed her locker with a soft click and walked toward the exit, each step deliberate, the sound of her footsteps on tile the only noise in the sudden silence. But before she reached the double doors, a voice stopped her, younger, female, trembling slightly. "Hannah." Sarah Webb stood in the corridor holding a manila folder against her chest like armor. She was Marcus Webb's adult daughter, home on leave from Fort Benning where she served as a physical therapist in the Army Medical Corps. Her father had mentioned Hannah exactly once in the 6 months since he'd woken from his coma with no memory of the ICU, no memory of the woman who'd saved his life. But Sarah had seen the security footage. Sarah had asked questions. And Sarah had done what soldiers' children do, she'd investigated. "Senior Chief." The rank hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Hannah's hands went very still. She turned slowly, her composure locked down like a reinforced door, but her eyes shifted into something older, something that had seen things the rest of the hospital would never speak about. "That's a classified designation, Ms. Webb. My father's evacuation report from Tikrit, 2007. Sarah opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside was a medical record, names redacted, dates redacted, but unmistakable. A handwritten note in the margins, * female operator, call sign smoke, priority extract. * and sewn into the jacket lining that had been in her father's possession for 17 years, a faded unit patch, the colors almost gone, just threads and memory. Sarah held it up. "This patch has been in my father's closet since he came home. He never knew why. He just said if anything ever happened to him, his daughter should know it mattered. The ER nurse manager approached cautiously. "Hannah, should we call someone?" "Yes," said a voice from the lobby entrance. A man stepped through the automatic doors, barrel-chested, shoulders wide as a doorframe, wearing a SEAL Team insignia polo that looked like it might tear at any second if he took a full breath. Commander James Vance, Naval Special Operations Command Liaison. He moved with the kind of controlled precision that came from 42 years of knowing exactly how much damage his body could inflict and choosing not to. His eyes found Hannah in the corridor and held them for exactly 3 seconds. That was all it took. "I'm Commander Vance, JSOC," he said to the assembled hospital staff, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. "This woman is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. In 2007, she led a combat extraction in Tikrit that brought 17 personnel home alive. 2 Navy Crosses. 1 Silver Star. 3 times wounded, twice returned to duty. That Army Ranger in the ER, a Marcus Webb, Ranger Regiment, he wouldn't be breathing right now if she hadn't pulled him behind a wall when his squad was taking fire from a minaret." Vance paused. And 48 hours ago, he wouldn't be breathing because a doctor delayed his cardiac care. But she saved him again. Because that's what she does. The hospital administrator, Patricia Hawkins, arrived at that moment with board member Whitmore trailing behind her like a satellite caught in her gravity. Their faces went through a rapid sequence of expressions, confusion, alarm, and finally a kind of dawning realization that something had fundamentally shifted in the power dynamics of Sacred Heart Hospital. "I don't understand," Hawkins said, but her eyes were already moving toward the implication. "You will," said a woman in a dark suit who emerged from behind Vance. FBI liaison agent Maria Mora. She held credentials that made the hospital administrator's face go pale. Dr. Sterling's actions regarding Nurse Clarke's suspension, the investigation into her license, and his attempts to delete security footage, all of those constitute potential obstruction under Title 18, Section 1503, if they were taken with knowledge that this individual's military record was classified under national security statute. Mora's eyes were flat, professional, and absolutely terrifying. "Which I can confirm it is. Senior Chief Clarke's service record cannot be discussed outside of appropriate federal channels. Which means Dr. Sterling, if he accessed that information to build a case against her, has a serious problem." That was the moment the room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the trauma bay 3 doors down. Hannah's hands were steady at her sides. Her breathing was controlled. She looked at Sarah Webb and said nothing. She didn't need to say anything. The unit patch spoke for her, 17 years of silence, and now the truth was bleeding out into this sterile corridor like a wound that had finally been opened. What happened next didn't just end careers, it ended a man's carefully constructed illusion of authority. Jake Morrison, the hospital's IT specialist and Marine Corps veteran, had spent the last 48 hours pulling security footage from the night of Marcus Webb's code. What he found made his jaw lock so tight he couldn't eat breakfast the next morning. Someone had accessed the security system at 4:17 a.m. using Sterling's administrator credentials. 8 minutes of ICU footage had been deleted, the exact stretch showing Hannah performing the pericardiocentesis, saving a life that Sterling had put at risk. But Jake had installed a redundant backup server 3 years ago, the kind of precaution that career military people take instinctively. Sterling didn't know it existed. In the emergency board meeting that convened 2 hours later, Jake presented the footage on 3 large monitors. There was Hannah. There was the needle. There were the withdrawn 200 ccs of blood from the pericardial sac. There was the cardiac monitor climbing from a flat line to sinus rhythm as the pressure released and blood could flow to the heart again. It was textbook. It was perfect. It was unauthorized and absolutely necessary. Then Jake presented something else. Timestamped emails retrieved from Sterling's account. An exchange from the evening of Marcus Webb's admission. Whitmore's face had hardened into something carved from granite. Administrator Hawkins looked like she might be sick. Sterling's attorney, who had suddenly appeared at his elbow, began whispering urgently in his ear. You endangered a patient's life to punish a nurse who challenged your authority, Hawkins said. It wasn't a question. Sterling stood. I made a clinical judgment. You attempted to destroy evidence of that judgment, Jake interrupted, his marine voice cutting through like a blade. You used your administrator access to delete security footage. Federal servers have records. Your backup attempt is documented. Your medical license is under investigation, added Dr. Reeves, another board member, for filing a false complaint with the Georgia Board of Nursing about her credentials. That's a felony. Sterling's hands had begun to shake. His face had gone from red, that deep, rage-filled red that had powered his humiliation of Hannah Clarke, to grey. The color of ash. The color of a man watching his world collapse in real time. I resign, he whispered. No, Hawkins said. Her voice was very quiet. You don't get the courtesy of resignation. You are terminated for cause, effective immediately. Patient endangerment, evidence tampering, filing false reports, and abuse of your position to retaliate against staff. Security will escort you out of the building. Your office belongs to the hospital now. They watched him pack his belongings into a cardboard box. The same sterile, clinical boxes that hospital employees used when they'd been fired. Within 3 hours, his network of connections, the board members he'd cultivated, the doctors he'd made deals with, had begun returning his calls to voicemail. 6 months later, Hannah Clarke moved through Sacred Heart's ICU with a precision that had never diminished, only deepened. Her scrubs bore no rank insignia. Her voice remained quiet. But nurses no longer abandoned her in the break room. Doctors no longer questioned her clinical observations. She was simply Hannah now, but everyone knew exactly who Hannah was. Marcus Webb appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, fully recovered, his hand healed to functional strength. He brought his daughter Sarah, who carried a carrier of coffee for the unit. When he saw Hannah checking vitals on a post-op cardiac patient, he approached slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might startle. He rolled up his sleeve. The tattoo was still there, faded but permanent, *Clarke* in block letters, 2 inches across his forearm. I got this in 2007 after Tikrit, he said. His voice was rough with the kind of emotion that soldiers don't usually speak aloud. I didn't remember your face for years. The trauma, the medications, the concussion, everything was blurry. But the name stayed. And then Sarah showed me the security footage. She showed me what you did. What you've always done. Hannah's eyes glinted but her composure held. You're alive. That was the mission. Sarah stepped forward and placed something into Hannah's palm, the faded unit patch, the one from the jacket lining. It was framed now, behind protective glass. You should have this, Sarah said. He has the memory now. He doesn't need it on a piece of cloth anymore. Meanwhile, at a community college 40 miles away, a man in a polo shirt taught CPR basics to a rotating roster of board students for $15 an hour. The students would often ask if he'd ever worked in a hospital, and Dr. Sterling would never answer. He would simply continue demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy, his hands moving through the motions with no authority behind them, no connection to the life he'd once wielded like a weapon. Hannah kept the unit patch in her locker, next to her stethoscope and her trauma shears. She would touch it sometimes on her breaks, not as a reminder of who she'd been, but as confirmation of who she still was. When Administrator Hawkins asked if she wanted to be formally recognized for her military service, Hannah declined. When a journalist from the Savannah paper requested an interview about the nurse who saved the Ranger, Hannah declined. She simply continued her work, quiet, invisible, and absolutely lethal in her competence. The hospital learned quickly that the quietest person in the room sometimes carries the heaviest burden. And that when you mistake silence for weakness, you make the worst mistake of all. On a Thursday afternoon, a multiple vehicle accident came through the ER doors, 6 patients, for critical. The trauma team mobilized. Hannah moved through the controlled chaos with a presence that made the air pressure change. She called out orders without raising her voice. Residents and nurses responded instantly, not because they were afraid, but because they understood they were following someone who had already survived the worst humanity could offer. By the time the last patient was stabilized, 2 lives had been saved that otherwise would have been lost. She walked back to the locker room at the end of her shift, checked her supplies for tomorrow, and caught her reflection in the mirror. For just a moment, the nurse uniform seemed to dissolve, and what looked back at her was a warrior who never stopped fighting. The unit patch hung beside her stethoscope, a reminder written in threads and memory. Sarah Webb had whispered it 6 months ago when she pressed the frame into Hannah's palm. Some tattoos run deeper than ink. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you've been with us before, welcome back. Hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here. Please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.